Hello, everyone. My name is Janine Parry, and I'm a member of the board of the Arkansas Historical Association. And I want to welcome you to the conference if you haven't been properly welcomed already, and also to this panel entitled Boundaries and Opportunities for Women in Arkansas. We are so lucky to have three excellent presentations with us today and presenters with us today. I just have a few things that the association has asked me to share with you. I'll then introduce each of the presenters with a brief bio, and then I will hand it over to them to make presentations of 15 minutes or less. And then we'll have some time for Q&A before we wrap up at 3:30 p.m. So just one tight and informative hour together. We will have a Q&A, as I mentioned, after each of all of the sessions, so that will come at the end. Please do know that the chat function is available to us, so you can post questions there, and we have a Lisa Spear in the background helping us monitor that, and I will as well. This session is being recorded and will be available on the association's YouTube channel at a later date. I do also want to let you know that there will be an anonymous survey that will pop up at the close of this panel. And if you could fill it out, everyone at the association would greatly appreciate it. So today, we are joined, and this is the order in which they will appear as they appear in the program. Today, we're joined first by Janet Allured. Janet received her PhD in history from the University of Arkansas in 1988. She spent more than 30 years teaching American and women's history at McNeese State University in St. Charles, Louisiana, where she also established the Women's Studies program. She now teaches adjunct through the University of Arkansas, for the University of Arkansas. She sits on the editorial board of the Journal of Methodist History, and we'll learn more about Methodist history later, and is the author of numerous peer-reviewed articles on Southern women, and her work includes as well co-editing several collections about Louisiana history, and in particular Louisiana women. Her most recent work examines the history of the Methodist Church, particularly Methodism and women, and that's what we'll hear more about later today. We also are joined by Wendy Plotkin, who's a retired historian who moved to Arkansas in late 2015 after teaching U.S. and urban history at Arizona State University and participating in public history projects in Chicago in the early 2000s. Wendy received her PhD in history from the University of Illinois at Chicago in 2000, completing a dissertation entitled Deeds of Mistrust, Race, Housing, and Restrictive Covenants in Chicago, 1900 to 1950. She also has published scholarship on the Chicago Housing Authority and the history of rent control in Chicago. Her latest work, however, examines Arkansas press women, and in particular, women who were formative in that organization and in the Arkansas press over in the last decade. And that will be the subject of her presentation later today in this session. And then finally, we'll be joined by Revis Edmonds. Dr. Edmonds is the historian for the Arkansas Department of Parks, Heritage, and Tourism. He is a product of Arkansas schools, including all the way through to his dissertation, which was about the Arkansas gubernatorial campaign of 1990 and how that shaped Arkansas's belated political realignment. Revis's research and teaching and publications has been wide-ranging, including Arkansas's African-American or some African-American regiments at the Battle of Helena, a Blytheville barbecue joint, and Arkansas's Diaz colony, the home, of course, of Johnny Cash. Today, we'll hear from him about some of the women pioneers in Arkansas's Republican Party. So with that, I'd like to begin today with Janet Allured's presentation entitled Arkansas Methodist Women, the Possibilities and Limitations of One Mainline Denomination's Female Activism in Arkansas, 1940 to 1990. Janet, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Let's see, I'm going to start my timer to be sure I don't go over. So first of all, let me just say that I am not as far along in this research as I thought that I would be. By this time, at the time that I wrote the proposal, I was thinking that I was going to have more time to kind of get into the archives than I have had. So just apologies up front about that. But nonetheless, with what I have been able to do, I'm not really sure that I want to continue the research, and I'm kind of looking for feedback from people in the audience about that, about the subject of Arkansas Methodist women. So let me just give you a little bit of background here, first of all, to let you know where I'm coming from. As Janine mentioned, this is part of a much bigger project where I'm basically working on Southern Methodist women in the modern, mostly the modern era. I'm a 20th century historian, so I don't really do 19th century really at all. And just to let you know too, because most people are not real familiar with the history of Methodism. Methodism has a lot of different branches. It has had a lot of different branches over the years because of different splinters of disagreements within the flock. And so North and South had split. The Northern Church split, well, the Universal Church split in the years before the Civil War, and there were a couple of other splits that happened. And the result is, again, you have a multiple denominations. So the only ones that I'm covering are the ones that are today the United Methodist Church. There were several different mergers that happened. So I cover the women in the United Methodist Church and its predecessor organizations only. There are separate African-American Methodist denominations that decided to stay separate. One of those was peculiar to the South, the CME. It was originally called the Colored Methodist Episcopal. Now it's a Christian Methodist Episcopal. And you may also be familiar with a AME and AME-Z, African Methodist Episcopal and AME Zion. And those are all separate denominations. And just because there's so much to do just to cover United Methodism, I haven't been able to look at those other denominations. Plus, we've had a lot of trouble getting into archives. I still have not been able to locate or get into CME archives, even though I kind of would like to do that, because the white women of the church made an effort to work with the Black women in CME, but I have not been able to get into the archives. So the pandemic has made everything a lot harder. Let me just put it that way. So anyway, what I concentrate on are Southern women. So I look at the Southern Church, which was the MECS, Methodist Episcopal Church South, which united with the Northern Church in 1939-40. And so then it became a national church. That's the Methodist Church. It doesn't become the United Methodist Church until 1968. So I know that can be really confusing, but I have to kind of lay that out there just so you know what the parameters of my research are. And what I'm looking at is the role of Southern Methodist women as progressives, because for the most part, I'm not the only person to say this, among white people in the South, Methodist women were generally much more progressive than, for example, Baptists. Baptists and Methodists, of course, are the two biggest denominations in the South. Baptist women tended to be, well, generally evangelicals tended to be much more conservative, but Methodists, partly because of the nature of their denomination, the structure of the denomination, which again, I can go into that if anybody wants to know, they tended to be much more liberal, much more progressive. And among Methodists, the women were much more progressive than the men. And that's partly because the women were less tied to capital. The men had to be more concerned about their businesses. And sometimes that did have an effect on the wives of those men. In fact, a lot of the times that happened because the wives didn't want to jeopardize their husbands' businesses either, because they depended on that as well. But a lot of the times the women, for whatever reason, either they had a supportive husband, or maybe they weren't married, or maybe they were widowed, or whatever the deal was, the women's organizations tended to take positions that were much more liberal. And that's the other thing I need to clarify is I'm not looking at just random Methodist women. I am researching actually the missionary organizations, and I'm concentrating on the ones that were focused on domestic or home missions. So I don't look at foreign women in foreign missions, except as they impacted the women who are here at home. So really what I'm looking at is what these organized Methodist women were doing here at home in terms of effecting change in the South, progressive change in the South. And there was quite a bit of it. So what I've been doing is looking at different states, because each one of the states is divided into conferences, and each one of the conferences has their own societies, which in after 1940, this is called the Women's Society for Christian Service, and it has an auxiliary called the Wesleyan Service Guild, and they all produce their own literature. And so there's a national office which provides guidance and leadership and publications that the women can buy, but nothing is forced on the local women. They can do, it's kind of like the League of Women Voters. You sort of pick what you wanted to work on. And so, as I said, I've been doing this kind of state by state and finding a lot of really progressive Methodist women, especially in the area of interracial relations. And then also later on, well, actually at the time too, in terms of feminism. But I have found less of that in Arkansas. So that's why I'm kind of bandying about the idea and really asking for a little bit of feedback from y'all as to whether or not I should pursue this research. One of the reasons that I wanted to work on Arkansas, well, I live here now and I went to school here in the 1980s, but another reason I wanted to work on Arkansas women is because a very famous Methodist woman comes from Arkansas, actually comes from Fayetteville. And Janine was good enough to let me write the women's history entry on this person. So I'm going to pull that up. And that's Teresa Hoover, who's from Fayetteville. Let's see, let me share screen here. Oops, there it is right there. So can you see Teresa Hoover? I can't hear anybody, but I'll take that as a yes, I guess.
Yes, so we can.
Okay, good. So this is Teresa, and she went to St. James Methodist, which is the historic Black Methodist church, you know, right behind the courthouse in the area of town that was the kind of the one street that was the Black area of town. And she was educated, well, I don't want to get too much into the weeds on her, but in the end, through the help of the Women's Division, which is the separate entity that comprised the women's organizations in the Methodist Church, she ended up getting hired by the Little Rock Council, which was an interracial council formed by Methodist women around Little Rock, designed to try to improve race relations. And then, you know, over the span of her career, she got pulled on up and she ended up becoming the national, basically the CEO, essentially, you would say. The title changed a little bit over time, but she became the national leader of this organization, the Women's Division. Found my statistic here. Oops. Excuse me, just a second. In 1968, she became the chief executive of the Women's Division, thereby attaining the distinction of holding the highest executive position ever held by any Black female in any mainline denomination in the country. The Methodist Church, when it reunited in 1940, was the largest Protestant denomination in the country. And the Women's Division, which is separate from the church, it has its own, now it has its own 501c3 status. The women did their own fundraising and owned their own property. So it was not taken away from them by the church ever at any point. And that organization, the Women's Division, was about 1.5 million members, and it was the largest women's organization in the country. It was the largest Protestant women's organization in the world, and it was the largest women's organization in the country. And Teresa Hoover from Fayetteville ran that organization for more than 20 years. And she was extremely influential. She was very feminist and very influential. But what I wanted to do today was not concentrate on her, because she is in the Arkansas Encyclopedia. She's famous enough that she made that. I will name a few other famous Methodists, and you'll notice that all of these people are very progressive people, just like Teresa was. Betty Bumpers, Hillary Clinton, and Joycelyn Elders are also Methodists from Arkansas. Well, of course, Hillary is not originally from Arkansas, but Hillary was a very devout Methodist, and that actually, like with most of these Methodist women, it colored her the way that she looked at social justice and the role of the government. These women were all generally very progressive social justice advocates. I will say it varied, as with any denomination. They don't all agree about all these things. But for the most part, the organization itself came out in support of progressive causes. So I have a bunch of them, and obviously I don't have a lot of time, a bunch of them that I could talk about, and I don't have a lot of time. I've only got 5 minutes left. So I will just mention some of them. I'll run through them, and then if people have questions, I can talk about them during the question and answer period. But one of their biggest issues, one of the top priorities for Methodist women who were, again, organized into these missionary societies, was interracialism. They sought to improve race relations and reach across that racial divide in a variety of different ways. One of the ways that they did that, you may be familiar with if you're a historian, let me switch over here, is through the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching. And Jacqueline Dowd Hall wrote the book about that, Revolt Against Chivalry, which you see on the screen there, Jessie Daniel Ames and the Women's Campaign Against Lynching. Jessie Daniel Ames was Methodist. She's Methodist from Texas. And she worked through the Methodist women's organizations in order to do this campaign against lynching. And Arkansas Methodist, just like Methodists from all over the South, because the church was still separate at that point, that is to say the Southern church was still separate at that point when this organization was going. It closed in 1940. Ames shut it down effectively in 1940. But in 1940, when it ceased to exist, when the national church came into being, she said, Jessie Daniel Ames said 80% of the membership of that organization were Methodist. So she was organizing through these Southern Methodist women's organizations. And I did check the Arkansas, as I said, they all produce their own reports, and sure enough, they are right up in there with everybody else in supporting the campaign against lynching. But when the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching ceases to exist in 1940, they will continue that campaign in a variety of ways. Basically, they do court watching, they put pressure on the governor, they put pressure on local legislators, the police chiefs, the sheriffs, to try to make sure, to try to stop these lynchings, to try to prevent them, and to try to shame the local population into permitting this to happen at all. So it was Methodists who were out in front of that, Methodist women. That interracialism will continue throughout the civil rights movement. They generally were supportive, as was the church, supportive of the civil rights movement. They were supportive of feminism. And I also want to make another point before I forget to, because it's a really big subject, because there's so many women who are involved in this, and there's so many different areas of concern. But I don't look at clergy women. I do look at their feminism, that is to say Methodist women's feminism, insofar as it is, they are concerned about making sure that women have access to the pulpit. And they get that after a long, hard fight in 1956. Women in the Methodist Church are able to be ordained in 1956. But because there's so few of them, they're kind of token for a really long time, and they got the worst appointments. Clergy women are really not the focus of what I'm doing. I'm looking at these lay women because there's so many of them, and they're so organized, and they're raising so much money. Over $100,000 in Arkansas alone that went to the national organization or to local causes. By the way, in case you wanted to know the numbers, there's about 11,000 or 12,000 of them organized in the North Arkansas Conference, and the other conference is a Little Rock Conference, and it's about the same number, 11 or 12,000. They were active in, again, virtually all of the civil rights campaigns. That is to say, they were supportive of them and encouraged people to be supportive of them. And they were also part of the Women's Emergency Committee to Save Our Schools, the one that the Adolphine Terry ran. They're very active in that as well. Anyway, any variety of concerns that you can think about, such as economic concerns. Let's see, I had a good quote here, which I can't find right off the top of my head. Oh yeah. So here they urge what they called Christian citizenship, which promoted continuous study and learning about issues of social and economic justice. They said, this is the North Arkansas Conference minutes, our women feel keenly their responsibilities of citizenship and keep well informed so that they might support an active enactment of constructive legislation. And they did, provide examples of those kinds of things that the women should write to their representatives about. And that might include wage and hour laws. They encourage the women, for example, to provide fair pay for the domestics. They encouraged the women to go into the Black neighborhoods and see what the infrastructure was like there. And if it wasn't up to snuff, like if the Black women people were getting shafted on infrastructure, which they typically were, to go to the proper authorities and try to get proper funding from public monies to support infrastructure. Schools, they were very big on, trying to get equitable educational opportunities for African Americans. So I have to stop. There's a lot more that I can say about that, but I'll be happy to entertain questions in the chat or elsewhere in Q&A. Let's see, and I know I need to stop sharing my screen too.
That is, sounds like a very exciting project, Janet. Thank you so much for that, and also for your timeliness. And hopefully there are a few comments in the chat already for you. Okay. And hopefully we'll get some more. So with that, I'd like to move us now to work by Wendy Plotkin on Arkansas Press Women. This is an overview. So here is an introduction. Thank you so much, Wendy. Oh, you need to unmute. I should have reminded you.
Here we go.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And let me just get my presentation here. And now let me do this. All right. And one more thing from me. There we go. All right. I would like to thank the Arkansas Historical Association for allowing me to present, and also the Arkansas Press Women for the privilege of serving as their archivist since mid-2020. And that's a first for me. I've been a historian most of my life. This presentation actually focuses on the founding of the Arkansas Press Women in 1949, because we're fortunate the founders placed a strong value on history and preserved much of the materials of APW's beginnings. Before I start, I'd like to ask those attending this session a question. Have you ever heard of Arkansas Press Women? And you could use, I guess, the chat or something to answer. I searched the archives of the Arkansas Historical Quarterly and found only a couple of references to the organization. It's my impression that they have maintained a fairly low profile among the general population of Arkansas during their 70+ years of existence, and your answers can help me determine the truth of that belief. Arkansas Press Women was established as an organization in June 1949, gathering a membership at that time of about 50 women by January 1950. Its target membership was women publishers, editors, reporters, photographers, and others engaged in print and broadcast journalism, both veterans and aspirants. And in this slide, I show 3 of the editors who became closely associated with Arkansas Press Women. That's Charlotte Schexnayder, Dorothy Stuck, and Rita Cox, and a legendary editor, Maud Duncan, who began to publish the Winslow American on her own about 30 years earlier in 1918. And the APW was organized in 1949 by Roberta Fulbright, who was the longtime publisher of the Fayetteville, first the Fayetteville Daily Democrat, then the Northwest Arkansas Times. Her husband, who was the publisher originally, passed away in 1923, and he had a lot of business enterprises in Fayetteville, and she had to handle those. Eventually, she became the publisher of the Fayetteville Daily Democrat about 1926, and her official title was president of the Democratic Publishing Corporation, the incorporated entity that owned it. She oversaw editorial policy and wrote a periodic column about local, state, and national politics as well. It's called As I See It, and I have a slide here that shows that. And it included, she discussed local, state, and national politics and impacted them, as well as the issues of living a good life at this point in the 20th century. She would talk occasionally about her grandchildren. In 1997, she emerged from the shadows of her more famous son, U.S. Senator J. William Fulbright, with the publication of the biography, Roberta, A Most Remarkable Fulbright. I highly recommend this book. Dorothy Stuck, one of the officers, served as Arkansas Press Women's president in 1953 and remained active in its affairs until she left the state in 1970 to take up a federal position in Texas. And she was born in 1874, Fulbright. She was 75 years old and ailing in 1949. And so she received assistance. And one was assistant from Walter Lemke, who I show here. He was a founder of the School of Journalism at University of Arkansas, and she lived in Fayetteville, and so they got to be good friends. Equally important was the Arkansas Press Association, which had been established and represented Arkansas newspapers since 1873. APA invested substantial administrative resources in APW, including an employee who served as the APW secretary. That was the first 25 years of the organization. A slot at its semi-annual meetings for an APW breakfast at which officers were elected and other affairs were handled, and a page in its monthly publication, the Arkansas Publisher magazine, devoted to APW news. And it's a great source on journalism. Women journalists, this is one thing I was surprised to find in my research, were not a novel presence in Arkansas from at least early in the 20th century. And as a matter of fact, the Arkansas Press Association highlighted the significance of women journalists at its 1914 convention. And the Arkansas Gazette followed its lead in the reporting of the conference. It included a photo of Speaker Sally Stanfield on the upper left, who had been at the helm of the Cleveland County Democrats since 1892, it reported. It also quoted a good portion of the speech of Mrs. Maud Johnson, who said, "For too many years, women have been debarred from their share of the world's work, with the result that today there are hundreds of idle, restless, dissatisfied women with no object, no ambition in life." One wonders if many years later, feminist Betty Friedan had read this when she expressed the same sentiment in The Feminine Mystique. And here I have a photo that was taken at the May 1914 convention, and it shows quite a few women. Unfortunately, there's no information about who is in the photo, so I don't know how many of these were the wives of the male members, but I'm guessing that a good number of them were actually journalists. Roberta Fulbright used the 1949 issue of Arkansas Press Association's annual advertising rate book to identify potential Arkansas newspaper women members. And it included information on the publishers and some of the editorial staff of all newspapers in Arkansas, weeklies and dailies and trade publications, their circulation, advertising rates, and whether they accepted ads for wine and beer on the one hand and hard liquor on the other. And looking at the advertising rate book revealed, at least to me, the gendered nature of American society and of newspaper business in 1949 Arkansas. It's a valuable resource. In these close-ups of the pages from the rate book that Fulbright used and she annotated, we can read between the lines to discern some of the challenges facing professional women journalists, as well as the historians seeking to study them. Her annotations, unlike the rate books itself, followed the journalistic convention of using Miss before the names of unmarried women and Mrs. before the names of married women, and using the woman's given name only when she was widowed or divorced. Her annotations are shown in green, show the sizable number of women serving as editors and in other professional positions whose names the rate book did not list. We also see the frequency with which the women added by Fulbright were the wives of the staff the rate book listed for a newspaper. So here we have Ed Schultz, who is the editor or the publisher of the Jacksonville News Progress, and his wife, Mrs. Claire P. Schultz, became the business manager. And so some women began in more of a business role, but many of them eventually became editors or did reporting. Further down, we see one of the relatively rare instances of the rate book showing a woman editor, in this case, Esther Bendersky, who was one of the few single women officially listed in the rate book who held a traditionally male position, and she was unrelated to the publishers or owners of the newspaper. Bendersky was one of the key supporters of establishing Arkansas Newspaper Women and was central to his decision in 1953 to affiliate with the national organization, the National Federation of Press Women, which is when the organization changed its name to Arkansas Press Women. A final observation arising from this page has to do with Howard Stuck, shown as the publisher of the Lepanto News Record. Stuck and his wife Dorothy, in fact, owned 3 newspapers in the area. And when Howard Stuck was stricken with polio in 1950, Dorothy took over the editorial duties of the Mark Tree Tribune, one of their other newspapers, and she stayed in that position for the next 20 years. One last striking feature of the rate book, for me at least, was its information on whether newspapers accepted ads for wine, beer, and hard liquor. I'm familiar with the gendered nature of the Prohibition movement, and I was not surprised to see in the 1947 As I See It column, I showed a picture of it on an earlier slide, the following sentiment expressed by Fulbright. I was brought up a rank and belligerent prohibitionist, the only way really to be brought up. My husband and I were teetotalers and fought for temperance in our little town in Missouri, which is where she was from before she came to Arkansas. As years passed and prohibition was finally made national law, it seemed to me that it did not quite qualify and made law evasion too easy and too casually done. And she proceeds to indicate her belief that prohibition should have been strengthened and that as a college town, Fayetteville itself should adopt prohibition. In conforming to the stereotypical belief that women were more likely to support prohibition, Fulbright suggests one of the cultural differences that might prevent women becoming part of the male staff of newspapers. Male journalism and heavy drinking are another common connection found in representations of American culture, as was detachment from the family. And so here we have a scene from the 1974 version of the movie The Front Page, and these guys are around and there's a lot of booze there. And we see the author of The Front Page, it says here in his memoirs, Ben Heck, the co-author of The Front Page, recalled that work and family precariousness were inextricably bound to the vocation, to a feeling of pride and belonging to a special group that made it unthinkable the reporters should dedicate themselves to any other task. In affiliating with the Arkansas Press Association, however, Fulbright was, let's go back down. Fulbright was strengthening a connection to an organization whose annual conventions were frequently sponsored by the U.S. Brewers Association. And so that's, this is from the Arkansas Publisher, in fact. We also find that Fulbright herself, in penning a note to Winslow American publisher Maud Duncan, who was one of the first newspapers to publish an account of the organizing meeting of the Arkansas newspaper woman. She was thanking her about the article, but she also asked Duncan if she was willing to accept advertising sponsored by the U.S. Brewer Foundation. And she also asked, thanks for any and all information that might help us to get you some advertising. And I think here she was trying to demonstrate the possibility of A&W serving as a link between newspapers and potential advertisers. So there may have been some conflictual attitudes Mrs. Fulbright may have had about alcoholic manufacturers as sources of advertising. Getting back to the planning for the organizational meeting of the Arkansas Press women, Fulbright handwrote an invitation list that included information on the newspapers with which the invitees were affiliated and the positions they held. We see here the sizable number of women serving as publishers, co-publishers, editors, and city editors invited to the meeting. So these were women who had held leadership positions in their newspapers. Here we see a distribution of the invitees, and what we see about them, they're scattered across Arkansas, many in rural and semi-rural areas, unusual for more than one to be from a county, and that's probably because the market for newspapers was extremely competitive, especially with the advent of TV. They were usually located in the county seat, which was likely to be the most cosmopolitan part of the county. Many of the newspapers were initially established and edited by men, but wives continue to run newspapers after the husband's death. Often, many of the husbands, when they were involved in the newspapers, were active in the Arkansas Press Association. And they were often family enterprises, mothers and daughters, family members serving in various positions. And so the entire family might be involved in all phases of the newspaper production process, from news gathering to printing, folding, and distributing. Let's see, and these were what I was just reading off. Here we have the program for the press seminar program, June 1949, U of Arkansas, Fayetteville. This was in lieu of the normal Arkansas Press Association semi-annual meeting. Instead, they had this press seminar at the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville from June 16th through the 18th, 1949. Most of the program is just the usual proceedings, which were male-led, dealing with issues of publishing and editing. But there was in it also this little note from Roberta Fulbright, in which she if you think the idea of organizing an auxiliary to the press association to be known as Arkansas Newspaper Woman is a good one, and won't at least 50 to 100 of you newspaper women attend the press seminar and let us know you'll cooperate. Being first of newspaper women, I believe that there is much that you and I can do in the auxiliary work to assist in the production of continually improving newspapers in Arkansas. And it's striking here, she's not talking about improving the condition of women, she's talking about women improving the condition of newspapers. This is a collage put together either by Lemke or somebody at the Arkansas Press Association of the women. He found images of the women who had been invited to the meeting. And here we see, this is from the June Arkansas Publisher, the women who were first elected to the offices of the Arkansas newspaper women. We have Esther Bendersky, I mentioned. Here we have an older woman. And what they don't show here, by the way, is within the first 2 years, A&W created the position of historian, which is part of the reason that my work as an archivist is such a delight. what were the advantages of organizing women journalists in post-World War II Arkansas? And this brings me to the last part of the presentation. The question that I brought with me in reviewing the records of the first years of Arkansas Presswomen was why 1949? I had initially assumed that women had had little participation in Arkansas journalism before the APW's founding, only to discover that women had carved out a significant presence in Arkansas journalism as far back as the dawn of the 20th century. Most of this, though, was in weekly newspapers, and newspapers which were a family project, which is why women could be involved. So why 1949? The answer came in part from an audio tape of a 1989 panel of former presidents of APW, most present during the early years. They agreed that, as was true of much else within American society, World War II served as a watershed for opportunities for professional work for women in journalism. The departure of newspapers' male staff members to Europe and Asia left a gap to be filled by young and old women alike, whether for personal fulfillment or the need for extra income. And the stimulating effect of this change is shown in the addition of a monthly column entitled Skirts in the Front Office in Arkansas Publisher. And this is in November 1949, written by the young editor of the McGehee Times, Charlotte Tiller. I think she was only about 19 at the time. After marriage to Melvin Schexnayder, she went on to become one of Arkansas's most renowned female journalists and the most prominent member of Arkansas Presswomen. And here we see her when she was in her 90s. You see here also a clipping from the Arkansas Publisher noting the jobs obtained nationwide by the graduating young men and many women of the University of Arkansas Journalism Department. We have another article in the Arkansas Publisher 1948, which talks about many of the established women in journalism. So this was a good body to organize with their resources. Now, there still obviously were many obstacles to women obtaining equal access to professional journalism roles, and this continued to exist after the war. Here, we look at the covers of these two Arkansas publishers, and this was after the conventions, and we see the all-male officers of the Arkansas Press Association, and then the women of the Arkansas Newspaper Women. Arkansas Newspaper Women was not meant to replace APA. Most of them paid dues also to the Arkansas Press Association, but they were not, they didn't really begin to fill the official positions till late 60s and 70s.
Wendy, I'm
Yes.
so sorry to break in. This is Janine again, but I need to turn it over to Revis. Hopefully you will get some more communication from our panel here as well. Or you and I could talk for several hours. I think I want to hear more about this. So with that, may I ask you to please stop sharing? Thank you so much. And Revis, we are ready for you. And I know you have an assist. So Lisa is ready. We're ready for you to share. Thank you.
Certainly. All right. Well, good afternoon and happy to be with you. And I am going to be talking about women who pioneered the Republican Party of Arkansas. And we're primarily looking at the period from about the time of women's suffrage to the early 80s, which was really, I guess you could say, for lack of a better term, the Reconstruction time for Arkansas Republicans. And why did women become so prominent in this effort? Well, part of it, in my view, is we've had the issue of Arkansas being governed, to an extent we do today, under a system of localism, particularly with small towns and rural communities. in which men, as the head of households at that particular time, literally drew their very sustenance from not just the small towns, agriculturally based economic systems, but also those were tied to a monolithic Democratic Party. So it was basically, if you wanted to maintain your livelihood, you did not kick sand in the face of the established political order. However, women did not necessarily have that particular, they didn't have that particular restraint. And they were the ones that were going to come in. You can advance. Lisa? Okay. That came in to fill the void, literally, for a party that was bereft from leadership from Reconstruction up into the 20th century. Yes, some of the Reconstruction leaders were still around, particularly former Governor General Senator Powell Clayton, who maintained an iron grip over the party for over 40 years, but at the same time, he saw the handwriting on the wall, and it was going to be primarily about patronage rather than winning elections. It did not help that Jim Crow came around and had a faction of the party attempt to walk away from the long-held belief in racial equality and attempt to get on, quote, the Lily White bandwagon, and it ended up backfiring. But women's suffrage was going to be, in a sense, even though few people realized it in Arkansas at the time, was going to be an ultimate breaking point for the Republican Party. Because not only did nationally women's suffrage pass with Republican support, but also many of the prominent suffragists in Arkansas also identified with the party. Advance. Okay, so the long revival of the Arkansas Republican Party wasn't again going to be represented by women. And even before the Rockefeller era, you had the Remels, particularly in probably where women first started coming to the fore, would be Ellen Lucy Cates Remel, known as Nell Remel. And she was the wife of Gus Remel, had been previously state Republican Party chair, and was the nephew of the successor to Powell Clayton, and that would have been Colonel Harmon Remel. And she was the mother of future Little Rock Mayor Pratt Remel. Now, after Gus's sudden death in 1920, Nell would in fact jump in and help fill that void. She would play an active role in Republican Party affairs, and this was really amazing that she was treated with so much credibility, both among Republicans and even some Democrats, mainly because, okay, the Remel name, but it was also because Arkansas was still very much politically a man's world. And one could even say that her Democratic counterpart in that particular description at that time was very likely Susie Pryor, the mother of David Pryor, husband of then Ouachita County Sheriff Edgar Pryor, who would be the first woman to seek public office in Arkansas after women's suffrage. But Nell Remel was one of the earliest movers in the formation of the Arkansas Federation of Republican Women, and prominent in all her son's mayoral campaigns, as well as his history-making 1954 bid for governor. Next. Okay, So the linchpin of the rise of women as really the engine of Republican revival in Arkansas, even outside of the arrival of Winthrop Rockefeller, was going to be the Arkansas Federation of Republican Women. They were going to be the movers and shakers. The first chapter is going to be organized in 1948 in Hot Spring County. The first president, Louise Rohan, would in fact help to get enough county chapters organized to where it would become recognized or federated by the national organization. This would occur at the national meeting in New Orleans in 1955. Marion Smith would also bring, from North Little Rock, would also bring the organization to attention on the national scale through her tenure, particularly serving on the National Executive Committee and a key ally of Winthrop Rockefeller's drive for the voting machine initiative in 1964. Next. But yet, Republican women really took off during the 1960s, and it was a small but very effective and articulate core that, along with Governor Rockefeller, pulled the party off the bottom rung of Arkansas politics. And the first one, and I think nobody can really talk about this era without talking about Leona Troxell. If someone appeared to be everywhere at once during that tumultuous time of change in the 1960s, Leona Troxell was it. Now, like a lot of Republicans at that time, they were transplants primarily from the North. Leona was from New York, met Nolan Troxell when both were performing wartime service in Europe during World War II. They fell in love, get married, classic story. But instead of returning to her native upstate New York, she winds up in rural White County near Rosebud, helping manage the family's cattle farm. Nolan Troxell was a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel. And of course, Leona was not somebody by nature who was just particularly suited to stay at home and raise the kids and help run the business and all this. She broke every stereotype in the book. She became a very key friend and ally of Winthrop Rockefeller, was one of the she organized the AFRW chapter in White County, and was a tireless organizer statewide. And when she was president of the group from 63 to 67, the number of chapters shot up from 10 to 61 counties. But yet she wasn't done at that point breaking down glass ceilings or kicking in glass doors. She would not be the first woman to serve in a governor's cabinet. That designation would belong to Doris McCaslin, who would serve in the last months of Orville Faubus's administration as revenue commissioner. But she would come into Rockefeller's cabinet as director of the Employment Security Division, what we now call the Office of Employment Services or Workforce Services, I'm sorry. And she was the original chair of the Governor's Commission on the Status of Women. But also, she was of a growing number of Republican women that put her name on the dotted line. In 1968, she would join a group of 5 candidates for the lower 5 constitutional offices, the 5 below lieutenant governor, in a ticket called 5 for the Future. She was the 5 for the future candidate for state treasurer. She visited all 75 counties at least twice. Waged a very valiant effort, but she was running against the very respected Nancy Hall, who was the longtime incumbent state treasurer and former secretary of state. And Leona attracted just a little over 37% of the vote. She still remained active, and even after Governor Rockefeller passed away and the party began its steep decline, she still stepped up in the Watergate year of 1974 and would join Ken Kuhn on a ticket for lieutenant governor, losing again to another very popular and respected figure, for at that time former Attorney General Joe Purcell, who was on a ticket with David Pryor. Her ticket mate, Ken Kuhn, lost to Pryor by 2-1. But yet she still was one of these women who would never remain silent, even when it came to her own party. She would become later a very strident critic of Republican Governor Frank White, both for his opposition to the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment and his appointment of the man who signified everything she found wrong with Arkansas politics, and that, of course, was Orville Thomas, to White's cabinet as Director of Veterans Affairs. And to my knowledge, Frank White and Leona Troxell never mended that rift. Next. But yet, with that same group came Lillian McGillicuddy, better known as Miss Mac, a product of Hot Spring County. She is in fact credited with forming the first chapter of the Arkansas Federation of Republican Women, established local chapter in the state that was in her hometown of Malvern in Hot Spring County. She and her husband Frank built a business there. And then she traveled extensively to help Leona Troxell and Nell Remmel organize other AFRW chapters. She would be the first woman to serve as vice chair of the state Republican Party. Like most at that time, had a very close relationship with Governor Rockefeller. And she would serve during the years that he was national committeeman. She would serve Arkansas as national committee woman for over a decade. And she is honored today through the Arkansas Community Foundation with an endowment with the Lillian McGillicuddy Republican Party of Arkansas Scholarship that was founded by the Arkansas Federation of Republican Women in her honor. But she was referred to often as the eighth wonder of the Arkansas Republican Party. Next. Next. And this lady I knew well from growing up in Hope, Jerry Pruden. We always do Jim and Jerry. They were just in the big house over on North Washington, and they were also movers and shakers both in the business, civic, and political community in Hempstead County. And Jim and Jerry were a little different from many of the transplants who came to help build the Republican Party at that time. Many came from the North. Well, Jim and Jerry came from Mississippi. And her father, in fact, her mother had in fact been one of the first woman to be elected to public office in Mississippi in modern times as mayor of their hometown of Decatur. In fact, Jerry told this story often. Her father once repeated very often, quote, "When you educate a woman, you educate a family." How am I looking on time, Janine?
We're down to just a few moments, so I would like for you to finish up, but also for people just to flood the chat box since we're running tight. Thank you so much, Revis, for adjusting.
Please do, sure. And of course, Jim and Jerry were active Rockefeller stalwarts at that time. She helped form the Hempstead County chapter of AFRW, but yet also served, not only having run for the legislature during a time when that wasn't necessarily accepted, but she also served on the state executive committee and would be the first woman to serve as chair of the Arkansas Republican Party. A lot more there, but I know we're limited for time. So anybody want to throw questions my way? Call or I'll see you Friday night.
And that'd be good. If I could, I know that both of our other presenters included their email addresses in
I'll
the
do it
chat
right
box.
now.
Will you do that for us, please,
Right
in the
now.
chat,
Here we go.
Revis?
I'll do it.
And I am so grateful to Janet, to Wendy, and to Revis for these fascinating projects. I hope the conversations can continue via email, etc., or at the reception for those who are able to make it. So we're at 3:30, but thank you to the presenters and to all of you who attended, and of course to all the organizers who were so resourceful and flexible once again this year for the Arkansas Historical Association meeting. Thank you so much, everybody.
Glad to see everyone.
Glad to see you.